Story 1. The apartment above mine wasn't empty. I moved into that apartment because it was supposed to be quiet. That was the whole reason. New city, no friends yet, long work hours. I just wanted somewhere I could come back to at night and not hear anything. No traffic, no neighbors arguing through thin walls, no footsteps overhead. The place I found was on the top floor of an older building. The landlord even pointed it out like it was a selling point. No one above you, he said. I remember that clearly because it mattered to me more than anything else. For the first few nights, it was exactly what I wanted. Still. Almost too still, if I'm being honest. I could hear small things like the hum of the fridge or the pipes in the walls, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then, maybe a week in, I started hearing something else. At first, it was so faint, I wasn't even sure it was real. It sounded like footsteps, coming from above me. My routine settled into something simple pretty quickly. I worked most days from about 9 to 6, sometimes later if things piled up. The office wasn't far, just a 10-minute drive, and I usually stopped at the same small grocery store on the way back. I didn't cook anything complicated, just basic stuff. Pasta, eggs, frozen meals when I was too tired to think. The building itself was older, maybe from the 70s, but it was clean enough. 3 floors with narrow hallways and that faint, constant smell of dust and old carpet. My unit was at the very end of the top floor, tucked away from everything else. I liked that. It felt separate, almost like I had my own space entirely. I didn't really know my neighbors. I'd see 1 or 2 people occasionally, an older man on the second floor who smoked outside, a woman with a dog who always seemed in a hurry, but there was never any real conversation. Just nods, maybe a quick hey, and that was it. Most evenings, I'd get home, eat something, and sit on the couch with my laptop or my phone. Sometimes I'd leave the TV on just for background noise, but a lot of the time I didn't need it. The quiet was enough. It felt calm, controlled. Looking back, that silence was probably the thing I valued most, which is why when those sounds started showing up, they stood out immediately. Not loud, not constant, just enough to make me notice. At first, I convinced myself it was just the building. Old places make noise, especially at night when everything else is quiet. Pipes shift, wood settles, things expand and contract. That's what I told myself every time I heard it. The footsteps weren't constant. They came and went, usually late after midnight when I was already in bed. Slow, uneven, like someone pacing without any real direction. Sometimes it would stop completely, and I'd almost forget about it. Then a few nights later, it would come back. There were other sounds too. A faint dragging noise, like something being pulled across the floor. Once or twice, a soft thump. Nothing loud enough to panic over, just out of place. I didn't think much of it at the time. It was easy to explain away when I was tired. But after a while, it started to bother me enough that I asked the landlord about it. Just casually, like it wasn't a big deal. I remember saying something about hearing movement upstairs and wondering if someone had moved in recently. He looked confused for a second. Then he just shook his head. He told me the unit above mine had been empty for months. After that conversation, I started paying more attention to the timing. It didn't take long to notice a pattern. Almost every night, right around the same time, somewhere between 1 and 2 a.m., the sounds would start. At first, just a few steps. Slow, measured. Like someone walking back and forth across a small space. Then it would stop for a minute or two and start again. Once I noticed it, I couldn't unhear it. I'd lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, following the movement above me. Back and forth. Back and forth. It didn't sound random anymore. It sounded deliberate. That's when things started to feel wrong. One night, it got louder than usual. Not the footsteps, but something else. A sudden crash, like something heavy falling over. It was sharp enough that I sat up immediately. My first thought was that someone had broken in upstairs, or maybe the landlord was wrong and someone had actually moved in. I waited a few seconds, listening. Nothing. No footsteps. No movement. Just silence again. I don't really know why, but I decided to go check. The hallway was empty when I stepped out. Everything looked normal. I walked to the stairwell and went up to the small landing that led to the unit above mine. The door was there exactly where it should be. Closed. I stood there for a moment, listening. Nothing. I tried the handle, just lightly. It didn't move, locked. For a second, I just stood there, not sure what I expected to find. Then I noticed something I hadn't before. A faint line of light under the door. It wasn't bright, just enough to be visible in the dark hallway. I remember staring at it longer than I probably should have. Then, just like that, it went out. After that night, sleep became harder. That night felt different the moment I lay down. I couldn't explain why, but I remember being unusually alert, like I was waiting for something to happen. Around the same time as always, the sound started again, but this time it wasn't pacing. It was slower, a dragging sound directly above my bed. I stayed completely still, staring up at the ceiling, following it as it moved across the same spot over and over again. It felt too precise, like whatever was up there knew exactly where I was. Then it stopped. For a few seconds, everything went completely silent, and then something slammed down hard. The impact was so loud it shook the ceiling slightly. I flinched, and I swear I saw a thin crack form just above me, like the plaster had shifted under the force. I didn't sleep at all after that. The next morning, I called the landlord and told him everything. This time, I didn't try to sound casual. He came by later that day with a key. We went upstairs together. When he opened the door, the unit was completely empty. No furniture, no signs of anyone living there, just a thin layer of dust covering the floor. At first, it looked exactly how he described it. Then I noticed something. There were footprints, fresh ones. After that, something in me shifted. I stopped feeling comfortable in that apartment. Even during the day, there was this constant awareness I couldn't shake. Like I wasn't as alone as I thought. At night, it was worse. I barely slept. I'd lie there with the lights off, staring at the ceiling, waiting for something to start again. Sometimes it did. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it was completely quiet, I still felt it. That same presence, like something just out of reach, above me, listening. I started hearing things that I couldn't explain anymore. Not loud sounds. Just small ones. Enough to make me question whether the silence was ever really empty at all. I moved out a few weeks later and tried to forget about it. New place, different building, everything quieter again. But every now and then, usually late at night, I still hear it. Slow footsteps. Not outside. Not in the hallway. Just above me. Story 2. My best friend started acting different. Then I found out why I've known him for as long as I can remember. We grew up on the same street, went to the same schools, spent most of our time at each other's houses. At some point, he just stopped feeling like a friend and more like family, the kind of person you don't question, the kind you trust without really thinking about it. Even when we got older, that didn't really change. Different routines, different responsibilities, but we still talked almost every day. If something happened in my life, he was usually the first person I told. Looking back now, there was a moment when something felt slightly off. It was small, easy to ignore. I remember he asked me a question about where I was going that night. Not in a casual way, though. It felt specific. Like he needed to know, not just wanted to. At the time, I didn't think much of it. We were close. That's just how we were with each other. But that was probably the first sign. We had years of history that felt impossible to explain to anyone else. Small things mostly. Inside jokes that didn't make sense out of context. Habits we picked up from each other without realizing. We didn't need to talk constantly to understand what the other person was thinking. It was just there. He was always the dependable one. The kind of person who showed up without being asked. If something went wrong, he was already figuring out how to fix it before I even had time to process it. I remember once my car broke down late at night, and before I could even finish explaining where I was, he was already on his way. That was just who he was, reliable, protective, even not in an overbearing way, just enough that I always felt like I had someone looking out for me. We had routines too. Certain days we'd meet up without really planning it, just because that's what we always did. Same places, same conversations, sometimes just sitting there without saying much at all. It never felt awkward. Other people came and went over the years, but he was constant. Relationships changed, jobs changed, life moved forward, but that connection stayed exactly the same. That's probably why I didn't question anything at first. Because when someone has always been part of your life like that, you don't suddenly start looking at them differently. You don't expect anything to shift. Even when it does, just slightly, it's easy to ignore. It's easier to believe everything is still the same. At first, the changes were small enough that I could explain them away without really thinking about it. He started asking more questions than usual, not just casual ones, but detailed ones. Where I was going, who I was meeting, how long I'd be out. It didn't feel aggressive, just persistent. Like he needed to keep track of things. I remember one night I mentioned I was going out with a couple of coworkers. Nothing serious, just dinner. He asked a few questions about it, then a few more. Who they were, how I knew them, what time I'd be back. It stood out, but not enough for me to push back on it. Then he started showing up more often, sometimes without telling me. I'd get home and find him already waiting outside, or I'd hear a knock late in the evening when I wasn't expecting anyone. He always had a reason, something small, something that made it seem normal. But there were moments when his tone shifted slightly. Like when I told him I couldn't hang out because I already had plans, he didn't get angry exactly, just quiet, short with his responses. Looking back, that was probably when things started to feel different. But at the time, I didn't question it. Because it was him, after that, things didn't change all at once. It was slower than that. At first, it just felt like he was more present in my life than usual. Like he had inserted himself into parts of my routine where he hadn't been before. If I mentioned going somewhere, he'd sometimes show up later, acting like it was a coincidence. If I didn't tell him, he'd ask about it afterward in a way that made it seem like he already knew. I didn't think much of it, not right away. It was easy to assume we just ran into each other more often. But then there were other things, small situations where I ended up relying on him, even when I hadn't planned to. My car had issues again, out of nowhere. He was the one who helped me deal with it. A plan with someone else would fall through last minute, and somehow he was already available, ready to step in. At first, it felt like bad luck mixed with good timing. Looking back, it didn't feel random at all. He also started making comments that stayed with me longer than they should have. Nothing direct. Just little things that made me second guess my choices. If I talked about someone new, he'd point out something slightly off about them. If I mentioned spending time away, he'd remind me how things used to be. It wasn't controlling in an obvious way. It was quieter than that. More like pressure. There were moments when I felt guilty for doing normal things, like I was somehow letting him down without meaning to. And the more that feeling built up, the more I found myself choosing the easier option, spending time with him instead, answering his messages faster, explaining things I didn't need to explain. At some point, without really noticing when it happened, my life started to feel smaller, more contained, and he was at the center of all of it. The moment everything clicked didn't happen all at once. It started with something small again. My car had been acting strange for a few days, nothing serious, just a slight delay when I hit the brakes. I figured it was normal wear, something I'd get checked when I had time. But then one afternoon, it got worse. I was coming up to a light, not going fast, and when I pressed the brake, it didn't respond the way it should have. The car slowed, but not enough. I ended up rolling further than I expected, stopping just short of the car in front of me. It shook me more than I admitted at the time. Later that evening, I told him about it. I remember the way he reacted. Not surprised, not concerned, just calm. Too calm. That's when something felt wrong. The next day, I decided to take the car in. The mechanic checked it over and asked me if anyone had worked on the brakes recently. I told him no. He paused for a second, then showed me. Something had been loosened. Not worn out. Not broken. Adjusted. Intentionally. I didn't say anything right away. But the first person I thought of was him. And for the first time, I couldn't explain it away anymore. I didn't confront him right away. I just pulled back. Stopped answering as quickly. Made excuses. Created distance wherever I could. He noticed. Of course, he did. The messages changed. Shorter at first, then more frequent. Then heavier. I could feel the pressure building again, but something in me had already shifted. The trust was gone. And without that, everything else started to fall apart. I still think about it sometimes. How the person I trusted the most was the only one close enough to hurt me without me ever seeing it coming. Story 3. Someone was living in my house without me knowing. Living alone was something I always looked forward to. There's a kind of quiet that comes with it that you don't really notice until you have it. No interruptions, no one else moving around, no need to explain where you've been or what you're doing. Just your own space, exactly how you left it. At least that's what I thought. For the first few weeks, everything felt normal. I had my routine, my habits, the way I arranged things in the kitchen, the way I kept track of what I had in the fridge. I'm not obsessive about it, but I noticed details, small things. That's probably why I caught it early. At first, it was just little things that didn't quite add up. A bottle moved slightly from where I remembered putting it. Food that seemed to run out faster than it should have. Nothing obvious. Nothing you could point to and say something was definitely wrong. I didn't think much of it at the time. I just assumed I was forgetting things. My routine was pretty consistent, and that's probably why I trusted it so much. I worked regular hours, got home around the same time every evening, and usually followed the same pattern without really thinking about it. Shoes by the door, keys in the same small bowl on the counter, phone charging near the couch. The house itself wasn't big, but it felt comfortable. A small living room connected to the kitchen, a short hallway leading to the bedroom and bathroom. There was also an attic space above, but it wasn't something I used. Just a hatch in the ceiling of the hallway with a pull-down ladder I had never bothered to open. Most nights, I'd cook something simple, eat while watching something in the background, and then just relax for a while before going to bed. Sometimes I'd scroll through my phone. Sometimes I'd just sit there in the quiet. Everything had its place. Plates stacked the same way, food arranged in the fridge so I knew what I had without needing to check. Even small things, like how I left cabinet doors or how I positioned things on the counter, stayed consistent. That kind of routine becomes automatic after a while. You stop actively noticing it, but it's still there in the background, keeping everything predictable. Which is why, when something didn't match that pattern, it stood out. Not enough to alarm me at first, just enough to feel slightly off. After a while, the small things started happening more often. At first, it was still easy to brush off. I'd come home and notice a cabinet door slightly open when I was sure I'd closed it, not wide, just enough to catch my attention. I'd stand there for a second, trying to remember if I'd left it like that, and eventually just assume I had. Then it was the lights. Once, I noticed a glass I didn't remember using sitting in the sink. None of it was obvious on its own. That's what made it easy to ignore. I kept telling myself the same thing every time. I was just forgetting. It happens. Looking back, that was the explanation I held on to the longest. At some point, it stopped feeling like forgetfulness. It wasn't one thing. It was how often it started happening and how consistent it felt. The cabinet doors, the lights, the missing food, it all blended into something harder to ignore. Then I started hearing things. It was faint at first, the kind of sound you question before reacting to. A soft shifting noise, like something moving above me. The attic. I remember pausing the first time I heard it, just standing in the hallway and looking up at the hatch. I told myself it was probably the house settling, maybe animals. That seemed like the most reasonable explanation, but it didn't stop. It started happening at night, usually when everything else was quiet, not loud, not aggressive, just movement, like something adjusting itself slowly, carefully. Around the same time, I noticed a smell I couldn't explain. It wasn't strong, just faint enough to linger. Something stale, like air that hadn't been disturbed in a long time. I checked the attic once. I pulled the ladder down, climbed up just enough to look around with my phone light. There wasn't much up there. Insulation, dust, empty space, nothing that immediately stood out. I remember feeling a little embarrassed afterward, like I was overreacting. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got worse. I started checking things more often, double checking locks, making sure everything was exactly where I left it before going to bed. Sometimes I'd even take pictures on my phone just to compare later. At one point, I set up a small camera in the kitchen. Nothing expensive, just something basic to ease my mind. I told myself it was just for reassurance. But deep down, I think I was already expecting to find something. I didn't check the camera right away. For the first couple of days, I almost forgot it was there. Then one evening, after another long day, I sat down and opened the app without really expecting anything. At first, it looked normal. The kitchen exactly how I left it. Still, quiet. Then I noticed something shift. It was subtle. A shadow near the edge of the frame, moving slightly where nothing should have been moving. I thought it was a glitch at first. I replayed it, slowed it down, and then I saw it clearly. Someone stepping into view. Not fully. Just part of a figure moving carefully, like they knew exactly where the camera was and how to avoid it. They opened the fridge, stood there for a few seconds, then stepped back out of sight. I just sat there staring at the screen. The timestamp showed it happened while I was at work. I didn't go inside right away. I stayed outside for a long time just trying to process what I had seen. Eventually, I called the police. When they came, they searched the house. It didn't take long for them to find it. A hidden space in the attic. Someone had been living there. I didn't go back inside after that. The police handled everything, asking questions I could barely focus on. All I could think about was how long it had been happening. Days? Weeks? Longer? Every small thing I had ignored suddenly felt different. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't harmless. Someone had been there the entire time, and I had been living with them without even knowing. Even now, years later, I still haven't been able to shake it completely. I live somewhere else, a different place, different layout, everything new, but the habit stayed with me. Every night before I go to bed, I check everything. Doors, windows, closets, even places I know no one could realistically be. Sometimes I tell myself it's unnecessary, that it's over, but I still do it anyway. And every now and then, I'll catch myself pausing in the hallway, listening, not for something loud, just for something small, something that shouldn't be there.